In case you haven't noticed, Nintendo's been hell-bent on keeping first-party 64, GameCube, and Wii titles away from the Nintendo Switch, and they've also been steering clear making Classic Edition consoles for these systems as well. Yeah, sure, Super Mario 3D All-Stars may have begrudgingly put one game from each of these consoles onto the Switch in response to this whole global pandemic thingy delaying Nintendo's 2020 holiday games, but even so, they're just gonna yank these 3 games away from us once Nintendo starts sprinkling their newer games out in March of 2021. I go into way more details and show more examples of Nintendo hoarding these game libraries from the Switch in a different video that I'll link in the comments description and on my own personal MySpace page, but the main question I wanted to answer today that I couldn't before is just why on earth would Nintendo leave so much money on the table and not just give the people what they want? And since I'm sure you've probably already read the title of this video, then you'd already know that I'm claiming Nintendo's gonna make games from these libraries as exclusives to the Switch Pro. But before you mail an angry letter to my publicist Bill Boner for making such a bold claim, make sure to crack open a can of aged bull milk, press the subscribe button if you haven't already, and allow me, Poland's #1 dupa boy Cameron all one word, to tell you why Nintendo's gonna lock 64 and GameCube games of the Switch Pro. Alright, so right off the bat, the Switch Pro is not even confirmed at the time of this recording, but seeing as how Nintendo's told developers to make their games 4K ready from this point forward, I'm willing to bet my son's allowance of the Switch is getting an upgrade sometime soon, just like the Game Boy DS and 3DS did in their days. But to make a relatively short answer even shorter, I think Nintendo's gonna try to lure people to the Switch Pro with 64, GameCube, and possibly even Wii games, because they've literally already done something similar twice in the past. The first time was when the Wii U was addicted to pills and selling rather poorly, so in an attempt to turn the struggling console's life around, Nintendo tried to sweeten the pot for potential buyers by adding Game Boy Advance and DS games while consciously leaving these libraries off of the much more popular 3DS, and I'm sure there's like 4 people out there who might be thinking that the 3DS probably just couldn't have handled emulating these games, and for those 4 people who are probably leaving upper deckers in my comment section right now, that's where you're wrong, because early 3DS adopters like myself were given 10 free Game Boy Advance games as a make good for the console's prices being slashed by $80 like 20 minutes after the thing launched, seeing as how, despite having such huge launch titles like Steel Diver and Pilot Wings, nobody ended up buying the dang thing. Seeing as how that's the case, we already know for a fact that even the standard launch 3DS had no problem running Game Boy Advance games, but even beyond that, the 3DS was already backwards compatible with standard DS games, and the handheld could download DSi and even full 3DS games, so there's absolutely no denying that Nintendo consciously chose to leave Game Boy Advance and DS games off of the 3DS, but then, Nintendo went an extra step and locked Super Nintendo games of the 3DS's upgraded and poorly named new 3DS model, and I know that Nintendo swears up and down that Super Nintendo games couldn't properly run on the standard 3DS thanks to its inferior GPU or whatever, but some guy was able to get Doom running on a pregnancy test for no money in his spare time, so I'm sorry, but I don't believe for a second that Nintendo couldn't have emulated Super Nintendo games on the OG 3DS, especially when we already know that it was at least capable of running Game Boy Advance games just fine, as well as, you know, full 3DS game downloads, so even though it might have required a little bit of extra work to do otherwise, this is yet another prime example of Nintendo trying to bribe people to buy new hardware with a retro game library. And as we all know, this tactic didn't move the needle for the Wii U one bit, and even though the new 3DS ended up selling well, I truly believe that there can't even have been one person who upgraded just to play Super Nintendo games, outside of the 3 or 4 people who were sure to lie about it in the comments, of course. So basically, Nintendo left assloads of potential sales on the table in the slim hopes of possibly selling a few extra hardware units, which does sound really silly to do, but then again, Nintendo's been known to leave money on the table in the past, so I don't really think it's that crazy to fathom. It really is a shame that Game Boy Advance and DS games were kept off of the 3DS for this reason, though, because it would have made way more sense to put those libraries on a handheld than the Wii U, given that they are games that were made to be played portably. That and, you know, the 3DS did kind of have all the bells and whistles that were just plain awkward on the Wii U gamepad. I mean, it's kind of like when parents offer the dumb kid rewards for getting passing grades while not giving anything to the smart kid who's naturally getting good grades. Regardless of whether Nintendo consciously chose to hoard goodies from the Wii U and 3DS to increase the hardware sales, though, which they definitely did, or if they legitimately couldn't figure out how to make the emulation work, though, it doesn't really matter, because it just feels like the exact same thing's gonna happen with the 64 and GameCube libraries on the Switch Pro, and possibly even the Wii, but seeing as that'd probably take a good amount of extra work to get the Wii Remote's mechanics to work on the Joy-Con's gyro controls, let's just go with 64 and GameCube games for now. Had the Switch just taken a page out of the Wii's playbook, then Nintendo could have had all these games on sale on day one, but since they had to try and get cute with their Netflix-inspired deal, the above-average sized den kind of backed themselves into a corner to where they pretty much have to put every console on the service, so even though I think bringing Game Boy Color and Advance games over before 64 games makes more sense, I feel like the 64 is still inevitable, and there's a pretty good chance that it might actually be next, but with Nintendo charging $20 a year for NES and Super Nintendo games, I can't imagine them making a whole lot of money on the service to justify adding that many more games for free, since most people are probably just paying for the service so they could play Smash and Splatoon online. fine. And even beyond that, while 64 games can certainly run on the Switch as proven by, well, a 64 game running on the Switch, the 1996 console is still a pain in the ass to emulate regardless of how powerful the hardware may be, and if this random-ass guy I met at Circuit City is to be believed, then Nintendo had to create individual emulators for each 64 game on the Wii just so they'd run properly, and if that's the case, then just tossing them on the Switch essentially for free probably wouldn't be worth the trouble for Nintendo, especially since they know how badly people want 64 games on the Switch. So either they add more expensive tiers to the Switch's online service, which I don't think is impossible, or they could lock these games into the Switch Pro while lying about the standard Switch not being powerful enough to get the job done, which they've already gotten away with for Super Nintendo games on the 3DS. Sure, some people might get mad and call Nintendo's bluff like I'm already doing right now, but I guess they could just add some regular Game Boy games to the standard Switch's online service at the same time to distract people. Don't get me wrong, much like Super Nintendo games on the new 3DS, I'm sure an upgraded Switch would probably have an easier time running 64 games. I just think that the real reason these games are going to be locked to the new console so Nintendo could sell more hardware. And unlike the Wii U and 3DS, I actually don't think this is that bad of an idea at all, because while remastering 64 and GameCube games would indeed sell a lot of software for remasters, and adding them to online tiers would indeed lead to a few more subscriptions, I kind of think the allure of playing these games on the go kinda sorta for free would entice people to upgrade their hardware a little bit, and the more Switch Pros there are in the wild, then that's more of a reason third parties have to bring some of their more demanding games over to what would essentially be a low-key Switch successor without the enticing install base of the standard model. And the more quality third-party games the Switch Pro has, and the more hardware that'll be sold as well, so I guess you could say that Nintendo's legacy content's kinda like the Kindle you'd use to start a fire with, which is literally the only reason I could think of as to why Nintendo's so desperately hell-bent against letting people buy 64, GameCube, and Wii games on the Switch outside of the time when they were backed up against a corner with 3D All-Stars. You know, either that or they're gonna make an online tier, but if that were the case, then I feel like they would have already rolled that out by now. But anyway, what do you think? Are 64 and GameCube games gonna be locked on the next Switch model in any way? Do you think there's even gonna be a new Switch model at all? Will they do online tiers, remasters? Either way, let me know what you think in the comments below, and as always, I'll try my goddamnedest to respond to everybody at some point. But let me tell you, if there's two people who are so great that Nintendo would probably lock them on the highest tier on the strongest console, then it would definitely be today's patrons of the day, Jizz Noof and Michael D. If you want to be badasses like these two, then consider supporting FU Game Crew on Patreon for loot boxes and silly rewards in the mail. Send pictures or videos of you rocking merch if you want to make cameos in my videos, and follow me on Twitch if you ever want to hang out whenever I play video games sometimes. My name's Cameron, all one word, and I'll see you next time.
So I want to say thank you to your loyalty, thank you for your support.